Hello and welcome to the Here For You podcast. In this podcast we explore topics of psychology, philosophy, mental health and therapy, as well as the intersections between these disciplines. If you'd like to support the show, please visit the Patreon page. The link for this can be found in the show notes of the podcast. Also stick around to the end of the podcast to hear about more details of workshops, different ways you can support, and upcoming shows as well. Have a good listen. Hello, today we're going to be exploring post-traumatic growth. So we'll spend some time defining what post-traumatic growth is, and we'll look at what this may look like in terms of people who experience post-traumatic growth. How might this look like for them experiencing that, as well as outwardly to the rest of the world. We'll also look at ways in which people may be promoted to engage with post-traumatic growth, how societies and cultures and systems may be able to promote post-traumatic growth, and we'll also look at the clinical implications of post-traumatic growth, so how clinicians can work to promote post-traumatic growth, how people may be affected in clinical spaces by post-traumatic growth, and we'll finally look at some of the controversies surrounding the topic of post-traumatic growth. We'll look at various ways in which people have critiqued the concept and various ways in which people have had arguments against the term and the research that is out there. Okay, so starting off with defining what post-traumatic growth is. Very broadly speaking, post-traumatic growth can be defined as positive psychological changes that are experienced as a result of the struggle with trauma or highly challenging situations. It's really important that post-traumatic growth is considered as a parallel process rather than an alternative one. This meaning that post-traumatic growth is a parallel to other conditions such as PTSD, as complex trauma, and that it's not a replacement. It's not you had either post-traumatic growth or PTSD. Actually, likely people experience both of those things in parallel with each other. It's important to consider the role of changing narratives within post-traumatic growth and how this relates to personal identity. This means that post-traumatic growth has just like with trauma, has a very important aspect of how somebody sees themselves and how somebody understands their place in the world. When it comes to post-traumatic growth, people have approached it from various different lenses and different ideas. Some people have considered post-traumatic growth from a aspect of personality change, so studied post-traumatic growth in the context of it entails some sort of change in personality or development in personality. Other researchers have looked at post-traumatic growth in the concept of coping, so this idea of researching post-traumatic growth through the lens of the coping literature and how people cope with traumatic situations. Something that's really important to consider with post-traumatic growth is that it is something beyond just resilience. So resilience is the ability to manage a situation. And what's different about post-traumatic growth than resilience alone is that post-traumatic growth doesn't just talk about moving on with life or just getting on with things like resilience might do. There's also an aspect here that is emphasizing the experiences of positive changes as a result of traumatic events. So the thing that feels quite unique about post-traumatic growth outside of just resilience is this idea that actually something positive comes from a traumatic event or series of events, not just that somebody has managed that situation. That's best captured as resilience if we're just talking about how somebody manages a situation, whereas post-traumatic growth speaks about something above and beyond simply resilience. Okay, so brief sort of discussion around what is post-traumatic growth. How about what does it look like? How might this look practically for people who have experienced this phenomenon? A frequent thing that people say is that post-traumatic growth looks like an increase in pro-social behaviour, so an increase in altruistic behaviours, in working with people, working towards a greater good. This has often been coined as a term as altruism born of suffering. Volhart in 2009 coined that term to describe the prosocial behavior that is seen in people who have experienced post-traumatic growth. The research also indicates that people who experience post-traumatic growth have an increased empathy and open-mindedness from prior to the trauma to after it. There's an increased empathy and open-mindedness in relation to that, and that there's a deeper understanding of the self, with the narration of the self as able to grow and able to develop through challenges and hardships. So there's a change in narrative, a change in identity there of how somebody identifies themselves and their place in the world through the way they understand their ability to manage and cope in situations, as well as the ability to grow from those situations. Another routine finding within the research is that there's been people who experience post-traumatic growth have an increase in gratitude and an increase in spirituality, a connection with a higher spirituality, a higher being is often reported, and also a higher connection within communities. And this can be communities that they had prior to the trauma, as well as communities that they've engaged with and developed after the trauma, maybe even because of the trauma that they've experienced. It's a little bit about what that looks like, how people might experience post-traumatic growth, what sort of promotes it, what's the sort of things that go into whether somebody who suffered a trauma will have the experience of growth from that trauma. This can largely be split into two separate types of factors. One of these types of factors is personal factors, and the other is external factors. And personal meaning from the individual themselves, factors that a individual may have either due to a trauma or prior to the trauma that might be more likely to engage in post-traumatic growth, and external factors being stuff in their environment, stuff that is outside of them individually that might influence or promote them engaging in a post-traumatic growth journey. Okay, so starting from personal factors. A big finding within the literature is that the sharing of negative emotions post-trauma is indicative of people engaging in post-traumatic growth. There's also a big aspect of cognitive processing, so how an individual makes sense of the event and whether they are able to make meaning from the event, whether they're able to engage in a cognitive process of meaning making from their experiences. And if they are able to do that, that increases the likelihood of somebody being able to engage in a post-traumatic growth journey. Particularly, this is actually narrating an event or series of events, the traumatic event or series of events, as challenging rather than just out of control or something that is devastating, completely devastating. Whether they can see the event and narrate the event from a personal standpoint as a challenge to overcome. If somebody has the ability to do that or can work on seeing the event as a challenge, it can predict the ability to engage in post-traumatic growth. There's been several studies that have highlighted that people with certain personality traits are more likely to engage in post-traumatic growth or go down a post-traumatic growth journey. This is of particular relevance is the personality trait of agreeableness. So people who are higher on the agreeableness scale from the big five personality factors are more likely to engage in a post-traumatic growth journey after having a trauma experience. There's also how centrally the concept of trauma is held for an individual, how central that event is to that person's life. And what this sort of means is how much they identify with the trauma or trauma events that they've experienced. What the literature says is that if somebody does hold that as quite centrally important in their understanding of the self, that it's more likely to promote post-traumatic growth. However, this is a really double-edged sword, as the literature also indicates that people who hold the traumatic event as central to their self-concept also are more likely to experience heightened symptoms of PTSD. So this kind of has both those elements too. The more central the trauma is held in somebody's mind can both promote post-traumatic growth, and it can also promote PTSD or other trauma-related symptoms and experiences. And another personal factor that's really evident within the literature is that women are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth than men. Women are more likely to narrate their experiences as meaningful and grow from those experiences than men, broadly speaking, and that younger people are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth than older people as well. So that's the personal factors, the individual factors that an individual may hold that may make them more susceptible to post-traumatic growth. There are several external factors as well. So one of these is spirituality and religion. So whether somebody either has a spirituality or religion prior to trauma experiences, and they can use that pre-existing spiritual awareness or religion to engage in a post-traumatic growth journey, or whether they come to a spiritual or religious place after having a trauma. But the presence of spirituality and religion highly predicts people are much more likely to experience post-traumatic growth having had those things in the background. The presence of supporting relationships is a huge factor as well. The idea that having people around you who are supporting of your trauma journey and more likely to engage in post-traumatic growth based off of those relationships. The literature also indicates that a high level of family resilience is likely to also predict whether somebody engages in post-traumatic growth, whether the family at large has been rated as going through tough times, and that's the family narrative all the way through. And this can be both family resilience to maybe the same trauma that a person has experienced, or the family having a more general sense of having been through hardship and being resilient through those times. A big external factor that indicates whether somebody goes on to develop a post-traumatic growth journey is the ability to take action in the moment of the event or straight after it. Is the person who has had something traumatic happen to them, are they able to do something or take some sort of action to combat against the event that they've been subjected to? If somebody is able to take action, they're more likely to take a sense of meaning and grow from that experience, rather than if somebody is unable to take action towards the event that has traumatized them. There's also employment, so people who are in higher professional positions are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth than people who are in either lower professional positions or are unemployed. And a really big one that's found again and again in the research is belonging and membership in a community. So if somebody has a community that they are part of and gets a sense of meaning and belonging from that community and feels like they are a member of that community, that can predict them having a experience of post-traumatic growth from a traumatic experience. And again, this can also be having that experience prior to the traumatic event. So if somebody already has a strong sense of community membership, they will more likely go on to have post-traumatic growth. And if somebody develops a strong sense of a community post-traumatic event, that can also aid in their ability to engage in a post-traumatic growth journey. Okay, now thinking about the clinical context and how, as clinicians, people can think about post-traumatic growth and work with that to promote that in people or to become more aware within the clinical space. There's several clinical applications here, and one of this is really taking a trauma-informed approach. So looking at questions such as what has happened to an individual rather than what is wrong with an individual based off the phenomenon experiences that they're having. A few episodes ago, we talked about the trauma-informed approach, and this is very, very relevant to encouraging people to engage in post-traumatic narratives and post-traumatic growth narratives in particular. So this is a big positive aspect of the trauma-informed approach, is that it can work with people to help them to develop a narrative that makes sense for them about their experiences and may hold an element of growth from those experiences. When working with promoting this in the clinical space, of critical importance is the therapeutic relationship, and perhaps it's always important in any therapy context, the therapeutic relationship, but within trauma perhaps in particular, the importance of creating a safe space and creating a emotionally containing environment in which a client can explore the difficult experiences that they had and make meaning from those experiences that are from them. And with this in mind, there needs to be a sensible encouragement from clinicians to engage in narrative and meaning making, and highlight the idea of sensitive encouragement, because what you don't want to do as clinicians, and what clinicians do not want to do, is encourage a narrative that isn't the client's. So this encouragement towards narrative and meaning making needs to be held with the person at the center, and it has to be their narrative and their meaning making rather than the therapist or the clinician's agenda that's driving how that client makes sense of the event that they've experienced. An encouragement of connecting and reconnecting to communities, so a space outside of just one-to-one therapy where people can connect with either people who've had similar experiences or just other wider communities that are meaningful for them. This may also be about encouraging reconnecting with the community. As has been evidenced, people who have had traumatic events may isolate themselves from community, may isolate themselves from other people through a sense of what they feel is the best way to handle the fear of the situations that they've been subjected to. But actually what we really see is that engagement with the community is very, very beneficial. And if this can be done in a safe way, promoting a connection or reconnection to a community, it can be incredibly powerful for people's trauma journeys and how they make sense of that experience collectively. Psychoeducation is really important around here. Post-traumatic growth is such a new concept, or relatively new concept, and there's not much knowledge about this. There's quite a lot of information around stuff like PTSD or other trauma sort of experiences, perhaps not so much knowledge or education around the post-traumatic growth angle. And sometimes just explaining to somebody what post-traumatic growth is may feel encouraging in their journey towards healing, in their journey towards finding meaning of their experiences. Key here is also the promotion of cognitive and emotional flexibility, so the ability to hold multiple realities, encouraging people that multiple realities can exist, and this can be about changing buts for ands. So people might sort of say, okay, I have experienced some growth from this experience, but I feel very sad from having had this experience. And as therapists, we can encourage people to change that but for an and of saying, okay, I've experienced growth from this experience and I still feel very sad about that. And just that subtle change of narrative can increase somebody's cognitive and emotional flexibility about how they relate to this series of events, that actually they can hold both of these things, that one doesn't take away from the other. And I think this is really important when we consider that post-traumatic growth is a parallel process and not an alternative one, and that implicitly within that, people need to hold this idea that actually people are experiencing PTSD and post-traumatic growth, and that just because somebody's experienced post-traumatic growth doesn't take away from the experience of PTSD that they are currently experiencing. And likewise, just because somebody is experiencing PTSD and all of the symptomology around that doesn't mean that a post-traumatic growth isn't possible. in that as well. These things are parallel. They're ands, not buts. Okay, so we've explored a little bit around what post-traumatic growth is. We've talked about what that looks like, what people experiencing that may experience. We've also spoken about the factors of promotion, both personal and external. And we've looked at some of the clinical context around how clinicians may be able to work with post-traumatic growth, very broadly speaking. Now, this being such a new concept, as we said earlier, there are several controversies around this idea. And one of this is this concept of toxic positivity, that the over-focus on post-traumatic growth may lead to a denial of the negative impact of trauma and a encouragement or over-encouragement towards the client to engage in just positive thinking. And of course, this can lead to this idea of toxic positivity, of somebody not experiencing the very real and difficult emotions that the trauma has brought up for them. And again, I think this goes back to this idea of holding that psychological flexibility, the cognitive emotional flexibility of holding multiple realities at once. That yes, there may be aspects that we can take positivity from, and there's aspects that have a incredibly negative and detrimental impact on somebody. So it needs to be very carefully and considered how people approach a post-traumatic growth journey, not to lead into a toxic positive place. And likewise, this may lead to denial of people's experiences, both from them as well as from others. And as well as this, much of the literature has focused on Western populations. And this raises questions about the cross-cultural application of the concept of post-traumatic growth. Much more research needs to be done about this to be able to identify more accurately whether the concept of post-traumatic growth is the same or even relevant across cultures that are outside of Western and particularly Western white populations. Yeah, the idea that of constant growth and constant striving against some sort of injustice is a very Western idea, is how to be a very Western ideal. So post-traumatic growth may look very, very different in other cultures and across different ways of understanding both trauma as well as understanding what growth means. Yeah, I think there's also this idea of who is growth for. So is the growth being promoted for the client, or is it being promoted so that their experiences is more palatable for society? People often want to hear stories about people overcoming adversity. People like to hear that people's struggles have been meaningful to them, when actually sometimes people's struggles are not meaningful to them, but they're just struggles. So we need to be very, very careful around who the growth is for. Is it for the individual, or is it for society to feel more palatable about negative experiences? There's also a very real concern that some of the findings that have been found within the literature have inconsistencies in them, and that this needs to be addressed really before we have a wider idea about the impact of post-traumatic growth and how to work with it. Some of these inconsistencies include the level of education that people have. Some findings suggest that people who have higher levels of education are more likely to engage post-traumatic growth. Others have found that people who have a higher level of education are more likely not to experience post-traumatic growth. So these inconsistencies really need to be understood further as to why we're seeing them and what it means for the concept. Okay, so looked at some of the controversies. Now just a very brief conclusion before I suggest a reflective question, a major reflective question for what this episode of the podcast has been. Something just to take away and reflect on and chew on and consider about what we've spoken about today. So in conclusion, post-traumatic growth is something beyond resilience. It captures the potential for positive experiences from traumatic events. So that idea of post-traumatic growth is something beyond just getting by in something, getting through something. It actually captures somebody experiencing a set of positive experiences from the traumatic events that they've experienced. A very key thing that we've spoken about today is this idea that it's a parallel process rather than an alternative one, and that post-traumatic growth can take multiple forms. And some of these forms are an increase in pro-social behaviour and an increase in a sense of community and a sense of spirituality. There are both a variety of personal and external factors that combine to promote post-traumatic growth, and that within clinical spaces, post-traumatic growth may be encouraged through taking a trauma-informed approach and emphasising connection. And this is both connection within the therapeutic relationship or relationships themselves, as well as an emphasis of connection with other communities and people outside of a strictly therapeutic space. It's really important to consider that there are various controversies surrounding the concept of post-traumatic growth, and that this being a new area, much more research is needed to address what these controversies mean and have some more definitive ideas around how best to engage people in a post-traumatic growth journey. Okay, so the reflective question for today is post-traumatic growth worth the cost of trauma? Be interesting to hear what people think about this. Do sort of ponder it. Is that growth that people may experience from a traumatic event worth the challenges that are presented with the trauma itself? Be interesting to hear what you think. Thank you for listening today. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're interested in supporting the show, please do visit the Patreon link in the show description. There's various different packages involved in the Patreon page, right from just supporting the show to further access to additional resources and access to workshops. You can also visit us on the website hereforyoucounselling.com. That's hereforyoucounselling.com. Again, a link within the show description. If you'd like to book onto additional workshops, there's also a link to the Eventbrite page in the show description. There's a variety of in-depth discussions around lots of the topics that we talk about in the show today. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show.